I made this flower crown about 18 hours ago, and in that time it has become clear that in today's world, the only two possible associations people have with this is weddings and the movie Midsommar. I'm not actually sure that's how it's pronounced. Welcome back to our coverage of Star Trek Prodigy. This week we are covering episodes 26 through 30, or Season 2, episodes 6 through 10. Last week we covered the plot-heavy and very emotionally dark opening to this season, but this week we start to move into more of the fun, episodic storylines while still moving the story along at an extremely respectable clip. In the past week, since Season 2 has released, I have come to a couple of conclusions that differ from what I said or implied last week. For one, I went back and watched the first 5 episodes and then these 5 episodes again after I got up to episode 10 for the first time. And I am convinced that this would have been an absolutely legendary weekly watch. I watched the first 3 seasons of Lower Decks in one weekend, and then I watched Season 4 as it released, and I found that the weekly release of Lower Decks was not nearly as exciting or interesting. And for that reason, I was under the impression that Prodigy would be better off as a 20-episode mega dump like we just got. Now that we have it, I think the fact that Prodigy's plot is so dense means that analyzing each frame of this week to week would have been an incredible experience that I'm frankly pretty sad we did not get to have. Hopefully, however, we will get that in Season 3. Last week I talked about how I don't think it's possible for Prodigy to get a Season 3, given what we know about Netflix and the situation with Paramount and all of that. However, seeing what I have seen over the last week, the absolutely stellar reviews that have come out of critics, small and large, I actually have changed my mind. I think that it is possible for Prodigy to get a 3rd season. Now, it is only actually possible for Prodigy to get a 3rd season if Star Trek fans continue to spread the word about it and watch it and get other Trekkies to watch it and so on. However, it did reach the top 10 on Netflix in many countries, although not the US, and Trekkies have been absolutely over the moon in the quality of writing. Previously, I have expressed frustration with how people who have been watching Star Trek for a long time didn't seem to get Prodigy. But it really seems like the changes that were made in the approach to the series from Season 1 to Season 2 made the series resonate better with fans of all ages and of all levels of experience. We will talk a little bit about the inclusion of Wesley Crusher when we get to him, but I don't think that's the only reason. For that reason, I'd just like to retract the negative sentiment that I put out about the possibility of Netflix redoing Prodigy. If I contributed at all to you, viewer, thinking that this could or should be over, please reconsider. Ask your friends to watch it. Apparently there is going to be a model protostar that I fully intend to put on my desk, and I suggest you do too. Like I said, Prodigy is Star Trek's best chance to look like a viable media property. But over the last 5 days of watching the audience response to Prodigy, I am more convinced that it is a viable face for Star Trek to have at this point. That's not to say that I ever thought negative of Prodigy, but I do have a bit of a negative view of the average viewer. Whatever it is about the difference between last season and this one that made it so much more approachable to people, I appreciate that it's there. I also want to address a couple of the plot points that I got wrong in last week's episode. I say last week, it was actually several days ago. I'm going through this as fast as I can because I definitely want to be done with this season before Star Trek Las Vegas. Anyway, in episode 2, Essentia says that Gwyn lost her heirloom, or her heirloom was stolen. These two things do not mean the same thing. I thought that Essentia was saying Gwyn's heirloom had been stolen, but she was actually saying Gwyn stole the heirloom that she has. Therefore, what I said was a plot hole last week was not a plot hole. I was also really confused last week about the whole thing with Chakotay and the through line in episode 5 where the children were trying to figure out what this weird spiral symbol was and where Chakotay was and all that stuff. I knew that not all of the details added up, but I couldn't figure out what I had wrong. As it turns out, some of the hypotheses that some of the characters threw out were incorrect. I was trying to listen to everyone and synthesize all of that into one total understanding of what was going on, but Janeway threw out a couple of hypotheses that were just incorrect. That the reason they didn't make sense is because she was wrong. So no plot hole there either. However, I'm still not exactly sure what the deal was with Gwyn's ship, the Sacagawea, being blown up at the beginning of episode 2, and then I believe Tysus says that it was blown up at the beginning of episode 4, if not at the end of 3. No, at the beginning. It was definitely at the beginning of 4. So I'm not sure what the deal is there. It's possible that there is some amount of anti-memetics happening, especially with what we know now, but we may not get an explanation for this one. The last thing I want to address before I get into this set of episodes is that last week I talked about how Gwyn being erased from the timeline was Dal's fault. Having rewatched episodes 1 through 5, while there are things that Dal could have done differently that would have caused things to occur differently, I don't think any of the actual mistakes he made led to Gwyn's situation. Again, he could have done things differently, but none of the things that he did that led to it were actually really stupid. He did choose to confront Janeway about the ship in Shuttle Bay 3, which was obnoxious. However, his choice to confront her about it did eventually, 8 steps down the line, snowball into Gwyn being erased from the timeline, but I can't say that that was actually his fault. If anyone is to blame, the most direct person to blame would probably be Majel, but I don't think we are supposed to believe that it is actually her fault either. Alright, now let's get into the 5 episodes that I'm covering in this set. Originally I was actually going to cut down to 3 episodes here, and then 2 from here on out. But there's a really interesting through line between all of these 5 specifically that I decided would make it more appropriate to just stick with sets of 5. So the first episode to go over is Imposter Syndrome. Alright, I'm going to make light of a serious topic, so if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, go ahead and skip ahead probably 90 seconds. So, there is a video game for Prodigy. It's called Supernova. Yes, I think it is probably a bad thing that they called that Supernova when there's a 2-part episode also called Supernova and apparently a book. Anyway, I have not actually played the video game. I don't know very much about it. But I do know that the player, I think alternates between controlling Dal and Gwyn, or can control them both in tandem. I'm not quite sure, but they are the 2 playable characters. And apparently when in this game, it is very easy for them to hit each other if you are not very good with the controls. Like I said, I've never actually played this game, and I've never even seen any footage from it, but I do know a lot of Prodigy fans. So I have heard this game referred to at least once as the domestic violence simulator, because the ease of which our 2 leads can just smack each other with no real consequence. I don't know how pervasive this nickname is, but in my mind it stuck, and a couple of weeks ago the game went on sale for 70% off on the Switch store. I still don't know if I'll ever play it, but I decided to pick it up just in case, and it has sat in the menu on my Switch untouched for, I don't know, a month. I don't know how long it's been. Anyway, every time I scroll past it, I see it there, and I think involuntarily the words domestic violence simulator. So episode 6 opens on Gwyn chasing Dal through the hallways of the Voyager, and it basically looks like she intends to kill him. And I recognize that this is not very funny, but I did think of that video game. I really, really enjoyed episode 6. I feel like I needed this episode. It's very silly and lower stakes, but it has really good character material for basically everyone in it. Actually, everyone. There's a lot going on, but it's also got some really cool fight scenes. It's silly and fun, and after 5 episodes of, watching Gwyn dying for the most part, I kind of needed this. After the cold open, we roll back 24 hours and see that the children are planning their escape from Voyager. I really wonder what's going to become of the children after this whole thing is over, because they just decided to leave and steal a ship. And man, it occurs to me that they could get out of this scot-free because their ship was eaten by the loom, so probably no one even remembers that it exists. I'm really interested to see whether they do anything with this. If they don't, I honestly won't be bothered, but they could. I do think that their noble quest will probably outweigh how angry Janeway would be with them otherwise, but I do think by the end of this, there will be some break time or scrubbing the filters on the holodeck for like a couple of weeks at least. While the children are working on this plan, they're inside the holodeck, which is interesting because it almost looks kind of like the bowls that Vulcan children are put in when they're in school. They're not actually in bowls, but I thought it was neat that for the children's schooling, they're able to be on the holodeck, just kind of touching things in order to move screens around and all that stuff. It seemed like a natural evolution of what we've seen before, and since the Doctor mentioned in the last set of episodes that there are 16 holodecks on the Voyager A, it really lent into one of the motifs that I have really liked from Prodigy overall. Last season, we established that the protostar has holographic emitters all over the ship, which is why Janeway is able to get around. About halfway through the first season, they are able to upgrade this to be able to make her hard light. But one thing that I was really hoping for that we didn't get to see last season was for the children to really abuse these hard light holograms. You know, they could use this for security. They could create duplicates of themselves to fight off intruders, or, you know, load in programs of soldiers to defend them if necessary. They didn't do that. I guess they didn't have the idea, or they didn't think it would be necessary until it was too late. But that was something that I was hoping we were going to get to, and so I was super, super excited when we got to this episode. I know that some people didn't like this one because it is technically filler, and everybody does take about 30 IQ points hit, but I didn't care. It was a fun time. Basically what happens in this episode is that the children decide they are going to run away from Voyager and replace themselves with holographic duplicates that will complete their internships for them. At the beginning of the episode, they perfect the robotic doubles and then immediately lose track of which of them are real and which of them are fake. The holographic doubles are so true to the originals that even they think that they are real. To make matters worse, the children decide to hunt down their own duplicates, and each pair of person and copy needs to figure out which one of them is the real one so that the real crew can steal the Infinity and leave the ship while the holographic duplicates stay on board. However, this really doesn't work, and by the end of the episode, they're all fighting each other, and it's great. What's funny and interesting is this is actually potentially the cheapest episode of Prodigy we have ever had. There are no new environments. All of the environments in this episode are recycled from previous episodes. Even the holodeck program that Dr. Noam is using at one point in a very brief scene where he's floating around in a lake is actually taken from the Fox Chicken sack of grain simulation back from Time of Mock in Season 1. There are no new assets used in this episode as far as I can tell. It is just the same assets duplicated. They don't have to animate 6 new rivals for our characters. They are just duplicating the existing models. That being said, this episode is a whole lot of fun, but it's also another one of those episodes that kind of checks us in with where everybody is in their character development. The first time I watched this set of episodes, I was watching it on my projector. I have a pretty good sound system that I've plugged into it. However, my projector has a really, really loud fan, and my ability to hear small details is not great. On my second viewing, I watched on my phone with some pretty good headphones, and it's pretty shocking. Not shocking, but poignant how much older Riley Alice Recchi sounds. I know there's nothing they could do about her growing up, but I think it's fitting. When each of the children goes to deal with their duplicate, Rock immediately befriends her duplicate, and the two of them decide to solve the problem together and end up solving the problem for everyone. Rock is at a point where she's very happy with herself, proud of herself. She gets along with herself well, and she's able to increase her total power by there being two of her. Basically, everyone else is subtracted by their duplicate. The next best pair is probably Jankum and his duplicate. The two of them set up a replicator that has been broken. They decide to see which one of them can fix it. Whoever can fix it is probably the real engineer. One of them is able to fix it. The other one is too nervous and gets butterfingers from the situation and is not able to fix it, has an existential crisis, and then turns out to be the real one. I think this is pretty neat, actually, because it shows that the AI duplicates actually do have less emotional complexity. Jankum was afraid of the possibility of not being able to fix the replicator, and therefore he was less able to fix the replicator. Therefore he lost, therefore he had an existential crisis. The other one is a near-perfect duplicate, but was not afraid, was just able to fix it, and just complete his tasks as usual. This was mostly a joke, but it also kind of foreshadowed the use of the duplicates later, and how they are somewhat simpler than the children, actually significantly simpler. I'm sure if they had been allowed to run for longer, they may have developed more complexity. But just like every other holographic character we've seen, they start out simpler than a real person. It seems to have been a while since episode 5. Maybe not like a long time, but a decent amount of time. We know this because of Zero. We do not actually see Zero interact with their duplicate or in any significant capacity. But we do get some very juicy new information about Zero, which is that they have started dating Majel, the telepathic pilot from Nova Squadron that we were introduced to last week. They don't appear to be an official item, but they are very close. They have definitely acknowledged their feelings towards each other at this point. They bump into each other in the hallway, and she apologizes for being more distant lately or something like that. So it has been some amount of time. We also know later that they can communicate across fairly large distances and mostly freely share information. It's unclear at this point what Murph thinks is happening in all of this. We don't get much from him at this point. But then we get to Dal. I am going out of order. So Dal immediately gets into a fight with his duplicate for no reason. Pretty much doesn't make much of an attempt to actually solve the problem. Refuses to believe he could ever be the duplicate himself. He starts calling the duplicates imposters and fakes, even though they've technically done nothing wrong. And he constructs this pointless us versus them idea because he's insecure and afraid of the possibility that he isn't what he thinks he is. We don't know how much he is still struggling with the fact that he found out that he's an augment and he is not the species that he thought he was when he was a child. But this is actually foreshadowing for the revelation later that he realizes he should not be captain of the ship. It's also about how his view of himself is super fragile, and he actually mostly hates himself, and a lot of his effort, his mental energy, goes towards what is effectively fighting himself. At one point, he tries to team up with Gwyn, and then she betrays him, like, literally 5 seconds later. I hope this is a callback. Please do not be foreshadowing. I want this to be a callback. If it's a callback, it's funny. If it's foreshadowing, I don't like it. I do think that Gwyn has a bit of a violence subroutine. I'm unsure if this is just Gwyn or the Vaunicott in general. She seems to get some amount of glee from chasing him through the hallways, and then after that, her duplicate comes out from behind her and attacks her with a fire extinguisher. And you get the distinct impression that even though she isn't smiling, she's definitely having fun. Eventually, all of the children get into a giant fight, minus Rock. No one tries to de-escalate. They all just get into a big clump until Rock shows up and gives them the solution, which is that they are going to go back to the holodeck, reboot all of the ship's holographic systems, and then set the holograms to turn back on after the original children leave the ship. They all line up, they agree to do the reboot. Dal continues sniping at his duplicate the whole time, for no reason. Before they blip out, Gwyn grabs his hand, but grabs the wrong one. This is almost certainly foreshadowing, but I have not seen the payoff for this yet, and I don't know what it's for. We will get back to the rebooted duplicates of the children in a minute. Next episode is episode 7, The Fast and the Curious. The Curious is Zero, and the Fast is basically everybody else. This episode is also partially filler, but like all Prodigy episodes, it's not actually. It contains some very important character development, some very important foreshadowing, and, of course, you know, Zero almost dies. So we open on Dal giving a captain's log and everyone else giving him shit for it. As it turns out, the other children do not want him to be the leader anymore. Although from this point on, they do still mostly defer to him to make decisions, at least for this set of episodes. They are really sick of his identity as their leader taking up so much of the space. I love the Infinity, which is their tiny little ship, which is really way too small for all of them. If one of them farts, they can all smell it, and they know they are going to be here for about 2 months. I'm surprised they did not bring up the fact that apparently at the end of the last season, they did all spend 1 month in the same shuttlecraft, which was glossed over. But we know that they can get along for that long. And they mostly do. But at this point, they've been on Voyager for a while, and most of the children have undergone significant character development. They've also been exposed to leadership by adults. Rock, for example, is no longer used to taking orders from Dal. She's been working under real Starfleet scientists who know what they're doing. And the transition back to Dal as leader has been difficult. On top of that, they're really only trying to get from point A to point B, so they're under the impression they can do all of this by consensus. Despite all of this, Dal is the one that pushes them to go into a Borg transwarp tunnel, which they agree to. But they are pretty quickly captured by a Kazon Maj of a small, desolate planet. The Maj demands tribute in the form of either their ship or its weight in gold-pressed latinum. The children are eventually able to negotiate their way out of this, but they do not realize that they step directly into the deal that the Maj was actually trying to get them into in the first place. He has been capturing pilots from the Borg transwarp conduit and pitting them against other pilots and his AI in order to train his AI. Yes, this is an evil AI episode. I've always liked the plots of TOS episodes the best, which is good because that's the kind of plots we're having this season. Ekthi, this guy's name is, tells them that his pods in his pod race require 2 pilots. So Dal and Jankum volunteer, and then Gwyn also volunteers. After I watched season 1, I listened to this one podcast in which these 2 dudes reviewed each episode of Prodigy. You know, there's a million of those. One thing that these 2 guys kept talking about throughout most of season 1 was that they really wanted Gwyn to be captain. And they kept saying they didn't understand why the story wasn't pushing more in the direction of Gwyn being captain. I thought that these 2 dudes were idiots. I thought that they fundamentally misunderstood the point of Prodigy. At this point, of course, in season 1, Gwyn is a bad person. Specifically, she is the former slave owner for most of the main cast. Actually, sorry, all of the main cast. I figured it was theoretically possible for Gwyn to eventually be captain of another ship, but not the Protostar. On top of that, I just generally liked what Prodigy has said about leadership, which we will get to a bit more later. But there was a line here in Season 2, Episode 7 that caught my ear, shall we say. At one point, the children are getting into the pods, and Dal says to Gwyn, "Negotiating is your thing, flying is my thing." And at that point, I could actually hear, like, a record scratch in my mind. I realized that it was not these 2 podcasters who completely misunderstood the point of Prodigy. It was me! I actually paused and I thought to myself, wait, was Dal supposed to be the pilot the whole time? And Gwyn is supposed to be the captain. We're going to get back to this a lot later. But this is the point of this episode. There are things that happen here, but the real point of this episode is to make you, the audience, go, hang on, is Gwyn supposed to be the captain of this ship? Because it has been a while, and Gwyn has done a lot of suffering. Most of the children no longer care about the fact that she used to be a bad person. On top of that, I've always thought that the title Prodigy was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, given its protagonist. But does it have to be this way? So the race continues, and both Dal and Gwyn do pretty good. Dal slightly better, but then he crashes. During this, Jankum, at one point, presses the boost button without Dal really knowing that's going to happen, causing the 2 ships to crash. causing Gwyn's armband to be damaged and for her to glitch out in and out of reality for the rest of the race. This is the second time that we have seen someone else on Dal's team cause him to hurt her. There will definitely be a third beat of this, but we haven't seen it. I'm afraid that the third beat that subverts the expectation is that it actually is his fault, but eventually Dal's ship is too severely damaged to continue, and Gwyn and Rock have to pick him and jank him up and continue out. Meanwhile, Zero and Murph try to get the lay of the land and realize that this whole thing is being run by an evil AI, one that is controlling Ekthi, the Kazon Maj. He explains that at one point the Kazon Oglamar had an actual pilot training outpost here, but the training program they wrote became more and more advanced until it was pitting the pilots against each other and killing them. Eventually it started to create robotic duplicates and used kidnapped pilots from the transwarp conduit to perfect its programs. Fortunately, it had no greater purpose, though, because it never actually sent any of these pilots outside of the planet that they were training on. Ultimately, however, all the children are captured, and Zero has to throw themselves into the computer to blow it up, causing them to irreparably damage their containment suit and pretty much exist as a inconvenient marble to be carried around for the next half an episode. At the end, Dal starts to give a captain's log but passes it off to Gwyn, who finishes the second half. It's kind of frustrating to watch Dal walk himself back from the relatively good position he was in as the protagonist of an "Are you good enough to save the girl" story. He pushes himself back into the protagonist of an "Are you good enough to even get the girl" story, which is worse off than he was last season. But I am glad that in this set of episodes we saw Gwyn actually pushing back against his idiocy and not being so passive when he does dumb things. That significantly reduces my frustration when I'm watching this. So we could not cover this section without covering the best mini arc in the series so far, which is the plot that follows the AI duplicates of the children back on the Voyager A. So when the kids leave Voyager, they reboot their AI, and there is a little bit of a glitch because they are escaping on the Infinity while they do the reboot, and they assume that it's probably nothing. But what actually happens is that all of the children swap bodies. I am so glad they brought this back. After episode 18 of last season, Mind Walk, it seemed like we may get body swapping again, but it didn't seem like it was possible for us to get the large-scale mass body swap that I felt an itch for without having to really bend over backwards in order to achieve it. And to be honest, this is bending over backwards a little bit, but it was so much fun, I really don't care. I laughed a whole lot. So of the 6 children, they swap bodies in groups of 2. Rock and Jankum swap bodies, which, despite having potentially the most opposite personalities, they actually just mostly come across as each other on a particularly good or a particularly bad day, plus an extra 40% in each direction. It's funny that while once you see it, it's obvious. To the outside characters, they don't actually really notice that anything is wrong with these two. To me, what was funniest is the fact that Gwyn and Murph swap bodies, but they actually behave almost exactly the same. We get some slight difference in Gwyn, but she mostly just remains quiet. And we later see Murph kicking ass while playing a sport, and it basically looks exactly like what Murph would be doing at any other time. But the one that really gives it away is the fact that Zero and Dal swap bodies. At one point in this section, Zero uses the catchphrase "yip yip," which I think is just a super lame catchphrase. Like, no offense, that was not the best writing decision. However, like 5 minutes later, we cut back over to the Voyager A, and we see Dal say "yip yip" at the end of a sports victory, and it was just so aggressively stupid. I think I made like a honking noise. It was hilarious. This was easily like probably my favorite subplot we've had the whole series. It's very, very funny. Does it really add anything? No, but it's just there for fun. And of course, Majel is the one who spots it, and then tattles because she's a tattletale. I guess we'll go ahead and get to this now. I really like everything we've seen from Majel so far. However, I do feel like I would really appreciate some more depth from her. I think it's super neat that we have a relationship between a Medusan and a Vulcan. You know, previous relations between, say, Vulcans and humans are fraught with but humans are so illogical and stinky and stuff. But we know that there is a very good relationship between Medusans and Vulcans kind of consider Medusans to be, you know, good enough for them. So I think that adds to how unconcerned Majel acts when around Zero. Also, as a member of Starfleet Academy and a member of Nova Squadron, she's definitely been inundated in Earth culture for long enough that she's not so attached to the, you know, high and mighty Vulcans are better than everyone else kind of mentality. She definitely does this to Dal, but she just isn't as habitual about it as most other Vulcans we've seen. That being said, I still feel like I don't really understand her motivation. In episode 2, the thing that caused her to attack Dal and Jenkem on the ship and try to get them put in the brig or court-martialed or whatever, it really seemed like she was trying to actually sabotage Janeway. In episode 2, she read Zero's mind, found out that Janeway was trying to do this classified thing, and then was planning to write a report to Starfleet Command about, you know, this potentially illegal thing that Janeway was doing. So, to me, the most important thing that Majel has done so far is literally try to betray Admiral Janeway, which is, you know, far more extreme than any of the other children. Is this really what she was trying to do? What is her motivation? We know that she's a tattletale, and we know that she likes Zero, and we know that she's very, very into Starfleet. But other than that, I'm really hoping that going forward, we have a bit more information about how she thinks and what her goals are. Actually, what's funny is she's pretty much where Zero was for me last season, which is a character that has potential, but I don't really know where we're going with this, and I would like to know more. In a way that's not necessarily compelling, but more like, hey, you know, can we get a little more meat here? I also want to say that when we got the plotline with the AI duplicates, and they all swapped bodies, I was really thinking we would get an extremely messy love dodecahedron with everybody that was left on the ship. But we did not. And I consider this to be the worst kind of crime. A crime against me. Okay, I'm aware that that would have been probably really stupid and it would have sucked. But a girl can dream. Episode 8 is There in Beauty No Truth? I think my favorite thing about this episode, although it is great, I think my favorite thing about this episode is that they probably took the episode title, Is There in Truth No Beauty, decided to name this episode Is There in Beauty No Truth, and then came up with the plot of this episode from that title, which is fine. It works. It works great. This episode, episode 8, is pretty much the equivalent of episode 8 of season 1, Time Lock, which was sort of the standout episode about a single character who is in the supporting cast that really explores a sci-fi concept in a very, very poignant way, and also changes the direction of that supporting character. In this episode, Zero is struggling with no longer really being able to move, and pretty much just sits in their chair waiting for things to happen, when they are contacted by a colony of Medusans that has figured out how to give themselves a real body. There are other incorporeal creatures. Eventually the group decides to go there and hopes that they will be able to find a new body for Zero on this planet. The locals hint pretty quickly that if Zero wanted to have this body, they would have to stay on this planet. But that's not the shoe that drops, right? Zero opts to take the body, not realizing that they would have to stay on the planet. And we get a new figure for them, which we'll get to in a minute. Zero opts to get the body, and it turns out that there is a festival going on, the Feast of Senses, in which all of these previously incorporeal creatures celebrate how wonderful it is to have senses by eating foods, smelling smells, dancing, and experiencing the forgotten sense, fear, by running away from this giant sky flap that eats them if they don't run fast enough. However, this information is not disclosed to Zero, and eventually Zero decides to not stay on the planet, basically because they do not want to be on a planet where the leader is going to lie to them about the circumstances of staying there. This episode is absolutely brilliant. I did enjoy all of the episodes in this set, but this one is the one that is the most, like, pure good on paper, shall we say. I wouldn't be surprised if this has the highest, like, critic score, if such a thing existed for this sort of show. It's a very TOS plotline, and it definitely improves on the last true Zero episode that we had. The previous Zero episode that we had was the Borg one, which solved the problem at the end of the day with the power of friendship by Gwyn basically telling them, remember that we are friends, and then Zero snapping out of being possessed by the Borg. In this episode, the problem is again solved by the power of friendship, but it's also got a more logical component to it. Zero tells Ion, the leader of this colony, that they would have stayed if it wasn't for the fact that the colony is built on lying to its constituents. And the idea is to basically get them addicted to, not addicted, but like show them all the good things before showing them the bad. At the end of the episode, Zero ultimately decides to go back to being on the Infinity with the rest of the crew, even knowing that their body is going to degrade over time without the something that comes off the rings of this planet that nourish their bodies or whatever. It's a really cool planet with multiple ring systems that sheds some minerals down onto the planet, which allows the Medusans that are living there to continue to nourish their bodies in some way that is irreplicable outside of this planet. So going forward, Zero will have this body for some amount of time. By the end of this set of episodes, their girlfriend, Majel, is part of the group and part of the ship, but presumably in weeks, months, maybe even a year, they will go back to being the cloud creature they were for the first however long their life has been. I find this really interesting because we have always had a character like Zero in the cast. Someone who is curious about what it's like to be more human. Data wants to feel emotions. Spock is in denial about the human parts of him because he was raised on Vulcan and, is about Vulcan society and all that stuff. Zero wants to experience the feeling of being alive. I'm not sure whether once this body degrades, Zero will die actually, or just have to go back to being a cloud creature. But the idea of life being fleeting for them is an additional dimension that I don't think we've explored in a main cast member in Star Trek, I mean. The dimension that makes this especially interesting is the fact that this body cannot stay. I know for a lot of people, myself included, it was weird to see Zero have a face. However, by the end of this set of episodes, and especially after watching this set of episodes for a second time, I was not only quite used to Zero having a face, I actually liked it. I felt like, actually now, if I were to go back and watch previous episodes, I would probably match Zero's new facial expressions to what we're seeing on this face now. I think the face matches them very, very well, and the expressiveness that was put into each of their reactions really adds to the enthusiastic character that we've had. That is, of course, not to belittle the efforts of Angus Imrie, who is definitely one of the stronger actors in this cast. Angus Imrie has done an incredible job throughout this entire set of 2 seasons, but I do think, for me at least, that Zero having a face has helped me to conceptualize this character, which I'm kind of ashamed to admit. But I'm glad that we had the real turnaround in the way I saw Zero last week, before Zero got a body. Next we get to episodes 9 and 10, The Devourer of All Things. I actually almost put Keep Your Shirt Tucked In on my bingo card. It's a line from Janeway that she says in Voyager when she's explaining to Naomi Wildman about what it's like to be, or what is important for a Starfleet captain to know. It's something that she says to Naomi because she's a child. A child's way of understanding the role of a captain. It's something that sounds dumbed down, but the more you think about it, the more it seems like something Janeway really believes. At the beginning of this episode, Janeway recites this speech, keep your shirt tucked in, go down with the ship, and never leave a crew member behind, to Admiral Jellicoe. I love how she puts just the absolute minimum effort into making it sound like she's actually losing connection. There are other times, I don't remember if we've actually seen it in Prodigy, but frequently there's the, oh, you're breaking up, you know. But Janeway almost barely doesn't even pretend. She just hangs up on him and goes through the transport conduit. There will definitely be consequences for this, but we don't know what they will be yet. We gotta derail the conversation for a moment to talk about Enterprise. I know, I always talk about Enterprise. I should really finish my coverage of Enterprise, but there's a reason I haven't. So we used to be covering Enterprise on this channel because Enterprise was my first Star Trek. When I was 10, my family started watching Enterprise on TV. We had never really seen Star Trek before, and Enterprise was our first exposure to basically all of this. But Enterprise has a bit of an issue, which is, well, I don't know if you would describe it as an issue. It's just a fact of Enterprise. 20 years have passed at this point, almost 25, and, this is just a thing that happened. But Enterprise is almost 3 separate shows. The first 2 seasons are an episodic, almost bog-standard Star Trek show, except with less technology and more of an underdog feeling than some of the previous series. I and my family really, really liked this because it starts from zero. It assumes no real familiarity. Like, there are definitely things that you could understand, but you can absolutely start from Enterprise and everything is explained because it's a prequel to the rest of Star Trek. Then in season 3, they take on a fresh arc. It's a season-long arc. They had never done that before, and that's the Xindi arc, which is actually kind of very similar to the Solum arc in Prodigy, but, executed very differently, shall we say. But then in season 4, the 2 showrunners, Brandon Brega and Rick Berman, were removed and replaced with Manny Coto. We talked about Manny Coto last week and how I didn't agree with a lot of the things that he did with season 4, and here's why. A lot of people will tell you that season 4 is the best individual season of Star Trek that has ever been made. I watched it again recently, and I still hate it as much as I did when I was 10. But I think this is just probably leftover feelings from when I was 10. When we got to season 4, my family still had not watched any other Star Trek. I had seen like half of a single TNG episode, but that was it. We didn't know much about what Vulcans were like outside of Enterprise. We didn't know that there were multiple versions of Klingons that did or did not have forehead ridges. We didn't know what Organians were, although I did like the Organian episode. Stuff like that. We certainly didn't give a flying shit about Will Riker. But Enterprise had been doing really poorly in the ratings for a really, really long time. Pretty much from the time it had started airing. Because of this, UPN, the channel that Enterprise aired on, decided to replace the executive producer to be Manny Coto. And one strategy that was undertaken for season 4 to try to win back the audience was to really lean into Enterprise as a Star Trek show as opposed to its own thing. When Enterprise first started airing, they hadn't even put the title Star Trek in front of it. They wanted it to be its own thing, a starting over point. This idea of Enterprise being its own thing was largely abandoned in season 4. The series changes formats from being individual episodes that may or may not be part of an arc to being 2 and 3 episode arcs for almost the entire season, each arc dealing with some tie-in to a later series, typically TOS. This was extremely popular with Star Trek fans. They finally felt like their real daddy, the original series and or TNG, was being represented in the story. But for my family, who had never seen Star Trek, we were just really, really confused. It felt like someone was standing in front of us and saying, "You thought that was cool. Well, that's crap. You know what's really, really cool? Will Riker, or Jean-Luc Picard, or whoever." Famously, Enterprise actually ends with a TNG episode. The finale of Enterprise actually takes place in the Next Generation, as some TNG characters are watching the events of Enterprise on the holodeck. For me and my family, we had no idea what was going on, particularly in the Mirror Universe two-parter, which, now that I've watched it again as an adult, it's an amazing pair of episodes. But when my family was watching it, we didn't know what the Mirror Universe was, and all of a sudden everybody was evil for no reason, and we were, like I said, confused. So I started covering Enterprise again on this channel, but when I got to season 4, I really hated basically everything I was looking at. There are a couple of episodes that I really like, but most of the episodes that I like are the episodes that everybody else hates. I would say that I actively hate more than 75% of the episodes in Enterprise Season 4. I felt personally insulted by it. It was the first time I ever felt personally insulted by a TV show or any piece of media, really. So now I have a pretty hair-trigger hatred for any part of Star Trek that has to stop what we're doing, look into the camera, and say, but you know what was really, really cool? Star Trek The Next Generation. I have not seen Picard, so I don't know how I would feel about it, to be honest. But I suspect that this has a lot to do with why All the World's a Stage did not resonate with me in last season of Prodigy. I didn't like the animation in that episode, but I think the positive things that everybody felt about it, which was, you know, a celebration of the original series, I think those just didn't resonate with me, so I was left with no real positive feelings about the episode. That is still my least favorite episode. So this two-parter, episodes 9 and 10, The Devourer of All Things, is actually about Wesley Crusher. Wesley Crusher is a character that I hate so much. A friend actually bought me a figurine of him for my desk that I keep on my desk at work, because my hatred of him is basically a meme among my friend group. But I actually love this episode. I think that with the mild possible exception of All the World is Stage, over and over again, in the vast majority of cases, and probably even in the case of All the World is Stage, Prodigy never, ever puts the rest of Star Trek before itself, which is an incredibly fine line to walk, because the very first thing to know about Prodigy before you even boot it up on Netflix, by the way, you should be watching it on Netflix, not pirating it, because we need to be counting those views so that we can get to season 3. Anyway, the very first thing you know about it is that this is a product that exists to assist parents in indoctrinating their children into greater Star Trek. The primary reason I had for dismissing the idea of Prodigy ever having a season 3 is that, technically, at the end of this season, Prodigy will have fulfilled its purpose, which is to get children interested in watching bigger, more popular Star Trek. Which is why I am so glad that Prodigy is so committed to justifying its own existence, its own continued existence. Prodigy is effectively Voyager's offspring. I've been watching Voyager in the past several months to try to prepare for season 2 of Prodigy to come out, and you can see how the themes of Prodigy were constructed from the themes of Voyager. But just as a parent is supposed to allow their child to be its own person, Prodigy has its own identity, independent of Voyager and independent of its granddaddy, TOS. So last season we got the introduction of the Voyager, we got Janeway, we got Okana, and a couple of other characters who are relevant to the story and themes of Prodigy. But Wesley Crusher is definitely the end-all, be-all character who could be introduced here, right? Like, of all the characters who could have a cameo in Prodigy, who could possibly be more meaningful than the OG Prodigy, Wesley Crusher? And yet I think this cameo works because, like everyone else in Prodigy, Wesley is treated as a person and not a symbol. Janeway is obviously a symbol within Prodigy, but she has her own motivations and flaws. She makes the wrong choices, she comes to the wrong conclusions, and while she is the paragon of the story, she is still a human who is sad that she had to potentially kill Chakotay last week. The same tactic is taken with Wesley. He's someone that Rock Talk really looks up to, and someone who is very, very easily compared to either of our two leads. But he's still a man. That's not to say that he's brought down to earth in some super nitty-gritty way. Wil Wheaton gives a chaotic performance of a extremely unhinged man who you can tell has been disconnected from linear time for a long time. He explains time travel and multiverses to the children. By the way, I still don't really know where we're going with the actual story, as far as, you know, is this going to turn into a multiverse situation? Is this, are we going to have alternate timelines? It seems like the answer is probably not. Basically, what we're looking at is this. Last week I talked a lot about the possibility of seeing a world in which Gwyn does not exist. At this point, that doesn't look particularly likely. It's not about a world in which Gwyn does or does not exist. At this point, those two worlds are so different that we cannot reconcile them. If Gwyn caused a split in the timeline by eating the wrong sandwich, it would be possible for her to just die to correct this problem, and then everyone else could continue living. However, because of everything that has happened so far, every person she has ever met is pretty much in a different location than they would have been if she hadn't met them. Without the protostar being at Tars Lamora, it never would have been returned to Janeway. The Voyager A would have never been where it is now. Everyone on the Voyager A, 2 schools, 29 decks, 16 holodecks, those people would all be, would they be on different ships? Would the Voyager A itself be a different ship designed to pursue a different mission? Janeway would be somewhere else. Not to mention the fate of all of the children. At this point, the difference between the timeline where Gwyn exists and the one she doesn't is so vast that if you tried to reconcile them, they would both explode. This doesn't even take into account the revelation at the end of this that Gwyn is probably supposed to be a big deal captain at some point in her life. So everything that she's experienced and done in the first 17, 18 years of her life have had an impact, but that doesn't even measure up to what she could do with the rest of it. So yes, we are looking at universe-ending stakes, but it really looks like the solution is still basically what we thought it was. Take the protostar, put it back on Tars Lamora in time for Gwyn's dad to go plant himself there for the next 20 years. That being said, of course, they did just lose their time-traveling ship, and they don't even remember that they ever had it. So, I don't really know how they're going to do that. But they did it once, and they can do it again. Wesley makes no less than 6 sweater jokes in one episode, and they are all better than the last. I really, really appreciated it. It's the kind of joke that works if you have seen TNG, but it also works if you haven't seen TNG. He just seems like a kooky guy, which is basically what they want you to think. Wesley explains the concept of the loom, which are these creatures that devour timelines that are unstable. They are attracted to Gwyn, but they will also eat, anybody around her. They don't really discriminate. But what they do is when they come in, they stop time for anyone not wearing a temporal discriminator, such as the one that Gwyn wears. So Wesley gets everybody else a temporal discriminator so that they can all move freely if they are chased down by one of these creatures. However, Wesley references obliquely that the Doctor did not really do a great job with hers, and that hers is worse than everyone else's. On top of that, at some point, the Doctor mentions that he has been working on improved versions of the temporal discriminators, and he will be giving one to everybody who goes on an away mission or has a reason to have one. So of all the characters in the story who have one of these bracelets, Gwyn's is the worst, which is bad because she's the one who will actually die without it. Of course, the coolest aspect of these creatures is that they have antimemetic properties. I don't know if I used that word correctly, which is a shame, because it's been too long since I read that book. When the creatures eat a person, all evidence of their existence is gone. The people around them forget that they ever existed. Their records are erased. It's unclear whether the person who watched them die will remember that they died for longer than a few minutes, or if that's a plot hole. A few years ago, I covered Inside Job on this channel, and one of the subscribers who was watching this suggested, based on my review, that I would like the book There Is No Anti-Memetics Division. I read it in about 12 hours, and it became one of my favorite books. I was actually going to do a video for this, and I made several props for a very silly skit that I wrote. but some logistical issues came up and I was never able to finish that video. But the point is, I was very, very excited to see this. The creatures are very much like the creatures from Live, Die, Repeat. They've got these tentacles. They're mostly black, and they've got these tentacles that are moving in a very Edge of Tomorrow way that glow at the end, and they chase people down and eat them, and when they're eaten, everybody forgets that they were ever alive. We see this happen to a poor red shirt, but this will certainly happen to at least one person named by the end of this. I'm kind of thinking maybe Zero. I'm kind of thinking maybe Dal, for reasons we'll get to later. I don't really think Dal's gonna die. I actually seriously doubt Dal's gonna die. But if we find there's a way for people to be brought back from this, I would assume that this would happen to Dal. Wesley hands Dal a data cylinder and tells him to not look at it. Dal starts talking, and after about 5 seconds just completely subconsciously looks at it, which is foreshadowing the fact that he looks at the data stream at the end of the following episode that he's told not to look at. Obviously, these two episodes, and in fact this whole season, have really, really obvious comparisons that could be made to Loki and the TVA. I at one point did a video on this channel about how much I loved season 1 of Loki, but I found that season 2 of Loki was a total mess that made no real sense. Everybody I've talked to, you know, at work and, you know, not in fandom spaces, but casual viewers who loved season 1 of Loki literally didn't even remember what happened in season 2 of Loki. And I told someone at one point that I'm still so angry about the ending to that show I could curdle the ocean. The one thing that I really wanted... Okay, I've used the phrase the one thing I really wanted out of season 2 of Prodigy probably 10 to 12 times. But one of the things that was at the top of my list was for this to do season 2 of Loki correctly. You know, we've got going forwards and backwards in time, we've got, you know, dire stakes, we've got repairing this paradoxical problem, this problem in our infinite multiverse, but it needs to be done in a way that's memorable and compelling. And I think that Prodigy has achieved this by grounding it in something we actually care about, which is whether Gwyn lives or dies. Simply saying it would be really bad if the temporal loom was not very good was, in my opinion, not good enough. But we'll get off the topic of Loki season 2. I do like that the concept of the loom requires that the children have to continue to use their ingenuity to get around them. They're able to kind of slow them down with phasers, but they're not really able to use violence. They have to either run away or use oblique thinking to get around them, to get away from them. The only person who is able to successfully use violence against them is Janeway, who is pretty much allowed to do whatever she wants in this story, so it's fine. So Wesley takes the children into an office under the ziggurat with the idea that they will wait out the attack from the loom that's happening upstairs. However, Majel comes in looking for Zero and is able to ditch her babysitter Tysus because she realizes that her love interest is in danger. They end up having to reveal their position in order to rescue her from a creature that is coming after her. In this moment, Wesley does try to allow her to die, because her death, in the grand scheme of things, is... he trolley problems away the idea of her being erased against the weight of repairing the hole in their timeline. He says that he prefers the prime timeline because this is the one that he came from and his mom lives here. But Dal steps over and mashes the button to open a portal to save Majel, and they have to run. I just want to point out, by the way, that in episode 3, Majel gave Dal shit for illogically going after Gwyn when they had received some message that, you know, she had fallen down into the pit and stuff. But 6 episodes later, she does the same thing, you know? It's character development, but it's also, you know, kind of funny. They leave the ziggurat, and Voyager shows up, and all of the loom creatures start to be attracted to Voyager itself, probably because there's more people on it. They start attacking the ship, and we get a really cool and brutal sequence in which the loom creatures start attacking the humans inside the ship, and people keep getting eliminated. I will say my biggest gripe from this section is the fact that when the loom creatures attack, there are some extras who die on screen, brutally. And then, because we don't have enough models for extras, those people come back a couple minutes later and they hope that you don't notice. I noticed on the first run-through. I am a more detail-oriented person than most, but you know, most people who pay as much attention as me are going to see it. And certainly some people who pay less attention. I do wish that that had been handled a little bit better. But Janeway leaves the ship and starts attacking some Loom that are chasing her. She fires a bunch of quantum torpedoes at them, and they take real damage, and the rest of them run away. Meanwhile, Wesley takes the children back down into the data center and calculates a route for them to be able to rescue Chakotay, take this protostar back to Tars Lamora, and allow Gwyn to be born. This is where we get what I would consider to probably be the bomb drop for this set of episodes. The children are placed on squares around this sci-fi fantasy computer and told to close their eyes while it makes the calculations. Otherwise, they will see their own future, and they don't want to do that. But Dal opens his eyes and watches. We see him hand Gwyn something and tell her that he never was meant to be the captain of a starship, and the implication, of course, is that she will take over. And I have complicated feelings about this, you know. I always hated the idea that the leader should be the person who doesn't want it. Leadership is hard. Like I said last week, being captain is a shit job. And it takes a person who really, really cares to be able to do that job. But there is truth to the idea that the person who is obsessed with power or image is unfit to lead. The thing is that Dal has cloaked himself in this idea that he is a starship captain in the making. It is the giant ball of band-aids that holds him together. And without all of his band-aids, we almost don't even know what's underneath there. I remember at one point in season 1, it's actually during the episode Kobayashi, Dal is taking the Kobayashi Maru, and he gets into a fight with Jankum, and he yells, "Computer Arch!" and he shoves Jankum out of the room, and his voice cracks. And I remember thinking, wow, Brett Gray is an incredible voice actor, because he has really constructed this character who sounds like someone else who is one bad thing away from exploding, but he doesn't sound like he's about to explode. He sounds like a person who is just operating on almost falling apart all of the time, but he won't actually fall apart, right? This is just how he is. The thing is, I relate to Dal a lot. It probably doesn't really come across in my videos, but Dal is probably the fictional character I've ever seen who reminds me most of who I was as a child. It would take me 12-hour-long videos that seem very much like therapy sessions for me to explain this, so I'll give a couple of examples. I was a gifted kid, and when I was in middle school, I explained to some of the girls that I went to school with. They were, you know, the preppy girls. I saw them at the grocery store. They were wearing, I think they were like wearing booty shorts or something, and I explained to them that they were stupid and that one day they were going to be working for me. I was about 14 at the time, but several years later, I went to a high school in which I worked for the IT guy as an intern. This IT guy also ran our school's First Priority, which is like a Bible study Christian club thing that was held every Wednesday during lunchtime. It wasn't really an official sanctioned club. It was just an event that students could come to if they wanted. I wasn't really pressured into going, but this instructor kind of implied to me that he would be happier with me if I went, and I showed up, and I showed up pretty often. Not all the time. I wasn't really religious, but I did go. You know, I wanted to be supportive of this instructor, and some of my friends were in it. And we had to give testimonials about, you know, why do we have faith in God? And I would explain to the other students when we had to practice giving this testimony that I knew God existed because I was so smart and perfect and special that I knew I was made for something better. that I knew I had to have a purpose, a calling that would be incredibly important to the fate of the world. And I believed it. I told people that I knew God was real because I had to be designed by a person who strived to create perfection. I was a student who was more akin to, say, Rock Talk than Dal in my studies, but I definitely had Dal's personality and self-image. But what pulled me out of this? By the way, this is a lot of why I'm so attached to the idea of portraying positive change in people in media, and how no one is truly good or bad, and, you know, you're a person of different quality at different stages in your life, etc., etc. But what actually pulled me out of this? Well, I attribute it primarily to three things. One, I went to a small school, and all of my friends were on my robotics team, which met after school every day. So I was in a group of very tight-knit friends that always had to see each other all of the time. Previously in my life, when I had been a jerk to friends, they had either pulled away or not spoken to me anymore or whatever. But instead, I had a very tight friend group that was willing to tell me when I was being a jerk. They were willing to stand up to me and put me in my place. And that was really important because no one had ever really done that to me before. Second, I read The Egg by Andy Weir, which is a short story about the concept that perhaps when you die, you reincarnate into every person in the history of humanity as a stepping stone to eventually becoming God. This was my first real exposure to the idea that other people also had hardship and had their own perspective. Finally, I watched Mob Psycho 100. Mob Psycho 100 is a brilliant anime that I recommend to all teenagers, about a young telepath who realizes that his incredibly powerful psychic abilities do not actually make his life better. He could use it to take over the world, or brainwash people into loving him, or, you know, move buildings, or any number of things, but they do not make him happy. And the message of Mob Psycho 100 is that you do not want to compare yourself to others. You want to compare yourself to the person you were yesterday, and that is the person you compete with, not other people. In Prodigy, Dal is a person we are introduced to as being seen as the dregs of the universe. His mom thought of him as nothing, and she sold him to Tars Lamora, where nobody knows who he is. So he builds up this idea of himself as this temporarily unfortunate but intrepid captain who's just facing his latest scrap in a long series of intergalactic adventures. This is what he tells himself, and what he wants Gwyn to believe about him. You know, the very first conversation that the two of them have, she says, "Tell me about the stars again." And he says something like, you know, "I will tell you stories that will make you feel like you are living among the stars," or whatever. He's a storyteller, and he's told Gwyn these stories so much that it made her want to explore space. But he also tells these stories to himself. He has told himself the story that in order to fix this hole inside of him, he has to be a Starfleet captain. But that's not true, or not necessarily true. In order for Dal to progress, he needs to separate the idea of being captain from the idea of being worth more. Because one day, you know, what if he did become a captain in Starfleet, and he was assigned to a California-class ship? Then would that fix everything? What if eventually he was good enough to be the captain of the Enterprise? Would he finally be happy? I don't think so. If you are afraid of being seen as less, the best you can ever feel is relief. Dal needs to accept himself for who he is, and not who he thinks other people will see him as better if he is. On top of this, cognitive dissonance will kill you. I think on some level he knows that he needs to be a pilot first. But he's struggling in school, and he just keeps doubling down on, I'm the captain, I'm the captain. It's making everybody hate him. It's making everybody irritated with him and reject his suggestions. In episode 8, he sits with Gwyn and he says, "Don't worry, we'll make this better," and she doesn't believe in him anymore. Between seasons 1 and 2 of Prodigy, I went back and watched the Deep Space Nine episode Valiant, which is about another crew of teenagers who, basically, spoilers for this 35-year-old episode of television, blow themselves up because they think they are destined to save the universe. They are Starfleet cadets who have mostly progressed through all of the training that Starfleet Academy was going to give them, but their hubris causes them to all get themselves killed. And I wanted to know, what did Dal do that was different than the captain of the Valiant that made his crew far more successful? And it is this focus, but even more than that, it is the awareness that they could die at any time. Dal is motivated, first and foremost, by fear. He is afraid that things will be taken away from him. He is afraid that he's going to be hunted down and killed. And when other people want to take shore leave or, check out this new M-class planet, he's always, no, we're about to be captured. The bad guys are on our tail. Gwyn's about to die. We have to keep going. And the captain of the Valiant in the Deep Space Nine episode was convinced that his crew was destined for greatness. But Dal is aware of the fact that his crew can die. The difference that we see between Dal and Gwyn in this set of episodes is that Dal is always prepared for the idea that they could be killed, which makes him a really good starting point for a captain, frankly. But Gwyn is willing to stop and smell the roses. It's shocking how easily, if you think about it more than 5 seconds, Dal and Gwyn slide into the roles of pilot and captain, given the foreshadowing that we've seen from this season and even the last. Dal's very first line this season is, "Not as fast as me," as he looks up at Nova Squadron. He sees the Nova Squadron uniforms and says, "I'm going to look so good wearing one of those." Whether or not he ever joins Nova Squadron, they are the group of ace pilots. In the first couple of episodes, when they take Gwyn hostage, they tie her to the captain's chair. At almost every major turn in the story in season 1, she's sitting in the captain's chair, including when Dal comes out of the Kobayashi Maru, having been told personally by the ghost of Spock that he sucks at being captain. I can't see the series any other way anymore. I think that one day Dal could be a captain, but his emotional problems have to be solved first. And by emotional problems, I specifically mean his problem with his self-esteem. This is not really his fault, He's been treated as the dregs of the galaxy for as long as he's been alive. But it is his burden, and it is his burden to bear. During this vision, Dal gives Gwyn something. There are 2 big possibilities it could be. It could be his comm badge, saying, I'm leaving Starfleet, or it could be his armband. I think they've telegraphed pretty strongly that at some point that fragile little armband on Gwyn that, keeps her alive is probably going to break. I think it's possible that Dal will give Gwyn his armband and try to sacrifice himself, which is noble. But he actually needs to be emotionally stable. Remember last season when he thought she didn't like him for 5 minutes and he tried to nobly sacrifice himself because he didn't think he belonged anywhere? Or the literal next episode when he tried to sacrifice himself again even though they have autopilot? He feels like he needs to be somebody, and if he's nobody, he can become somebody by killing himself. He's tired of feeling alone in the universe, or without direction, or without a home. And the only way he can see out of this is by becoming someone. But you have to create the someone you are going to become for yourself. You cannot just attach yourself to a title and expect that to solve your problems. I am kind of now attached to the idea of Dal getting eaten by a loom creature because I thought we would see the world without Gwyn. It doesn't look like we will see that, but I think it would be interesting if we saw the world without Dal. I love alternate timelines, and I just want to see him, okay? I want to see alternate timelines. I know we were getting a Mirror Universe episode, but I could really deal with, 20 more of these. We need season 3. So I think the big thing that we are left with at this point, other than Chakotay, yes, next episode we're totally going to deal with Chakotay. We're finally there, Chakotay's there, we're getting there. But I think the not directly plot-related thing that has been left open for us that we do not know, that the series has been deliberately holding from us and teasing us with, is the question, what does Gwyn want? I mean, this is borderline the question that we left season 1 on as well. And I think part of it is she doesn't actually know. In her personal log that starts out episode 9, she says she has been confused about many things. Mostly she just doesn't want to be dead. I think in some order she probably wants to not be dead. She wants to save Solomon. And after that, she wants to be able to make her own decisions. Right now she's getting yoinked around by big emergencies, and she's never had time to actually sit down and figure out what she would like to do. I don't think she actually has an idea of what she will do once this whole emergency is over. It does appear that she doesn't give that many shits about Starfleet. She tells the rest of the group that she doesn't really care if they steal the Infinity, even if it is betraying Janeway. She just wants to take the ship. That being said, it does appear that she has started to think about the idea of being captain, and it seems like something that she's actually interested in. She joins the race, she starts making more suggestions, she stops being such a passive member of the group and starts taking a more active role. Obviously, of course, she and Dal are sharing captain's logs. So that's where we're at the midway point of Season 2 of Prodigy. I'm genuinely quite sad there are only 10 episodes left. During my coverage of last season, I could at least look forward to this season, but I know that at a minimum it will be 2 or 3 years before we get any more, and it's possible we will never get anything else. I'm quite attached to this at this point, and I'm pretty disappointed that, there's not a whole lot left. So I have 3 things that I want going forward. For one, I want at least somewhat sensible antimimetics. The Infinity got eaten by the Loom creatures and completely disappeared this episode. I want the characters to either not talk about the Infinity, or there be an actual reason for them to remember it. I want them to forget the characters that got eaten, and so on. If we're going with the idea of people being deleted, commit to that and execute it well. Second, I want to see Gwyn actually lead. We know that Gwyn makes decent decisions, but she doesn't have the situational awareness that Dal does. She doesn't monitor the rest of their group the way he does. She doesn't take a role leading emotionally. She did get the badass captain speech at the end of last season, but she did it in Klingon, and nobody heard her except that Klingon woman. So, I can believe that Dal has more character development he needs to undergo before he either gives up on being captain or comes back around to being captain later in life. But I was always under the impression that Gwyn was going to be an ambassador. I was never under the impression that she would want to be a captain until episode 7 of this season, because she just seemed to not have any desire for that. She doesn't have this group awareness. She doesn't participate in problem solving in the same way that Dal does. I want to see her actually take on leadership if I'm going to be convinced that she should be leading. Finally, of course, like I said, I want to know more about Majel. Alright, so let's check in on our bingo sheet. I don't know if anybody cares about this, but I'm having fun. Someone sees their future or a version of it. We have actually seen this. That is Dal seeing himself telling Gwyn to be captain of the ship. So, here we go. Neelix, nothing. Vaunicott used genetic engineering, still no. Return of the Rev 12, no, but hopefully we'll see this. Dal, Gwyn, psychic something. I really don't think we're going to see this anymore. For one, we see a whole lot of telepathy happening between Zero and Majel, and for two, this season has definitely focused on the friction between them and the conflict that they have, and I don't think that is really compatible with what I thought was going to happen. Janeway mentions coffee. She does. Rock Talk, as well, the AI version of Rock Talk with Jacob's personality calls coffee bean water or mud water, rock water. I don't remember, but Janeway says, "Yeah, I'll sit over here with my mud water," or whatever. Bean water. Evil augment. Still no. UMH709, no. Salamander is a serious topic. I don't think this is really happening, but, Dal is coming to his conclusions about himself and his future, mostly by himself or watching himself in the data processor. So I think that the conclusions that I thought he was going to draw, or he's getting to from a different direction. Zero has feelings for Gwyn, definitely not. Goatee. Next week, I believe we're getting to the Mirror Universe episode, so hopefully avoid obvious America parallel. It looks like if we can keep this one going, we will have bingo up and down here. But if Essentia utters the words "Make Solemn Great Again," we cannot we cannot turn this one green. Destruction of Mars, no. Dal cites a Starfleet regulation. Come on, kid, get with the program. Dal leaves. Obviously, we're not at the end yet. Kids tell the other crew about time of the protostar. This could very well happen next week. Clean reference to something filthy. Somehow, we have not had this happen yet. So that's our coverage of Star Trek Prodigy, episodes 26 through 30. Next week, we are going to continue with 31 through 35. See you at the next one.